So first of all, I'd like to thank the organizers for giving me the opportunity to present some of my recent research here. I'm going to talk about anisotropic nonlinear PDE models arising in biology, but more generally, my research is at the interface of analysis of PDEs and variational models, numerical analysis, and applications. And the applications I've considered as part of my research are quite diverse. Today, I'm mainly talking about biological applications, such as the simulation of fingerprint patterns, where we're interested in understanding how very large numbers of cells interact with each other. But there are also many other applications where we're interested in very complex models. For instance, for describing biological networks, we're interested in considering PDEs or graphs, which also involves quite a lot of mathematical analysis and numerics. And there are also a number of applications in industry or data science where I've been working on those mathematical models and did both analysis and numerics. But as I said before, today I'm going to focus on the application of simulating fingerprint patterns. And this application is motivated by fingerprint identification algorithms, where we need large databases to develop and validate those fingerprint identification algorithms. However, due to data protection and privacy regulations, it's basically impossible to collect these very large databases of real fingerprint patterns. And this actually motivates us to create synthetic fingerprint images on a computer. Secondly, modeling the formation of fingerprint patterns is also of great interest to the biological community. But last but not least, the models we consider are also quite challenging mathematically, and indeed they can be considered as a generalization of a very popular class of mathematical models. In terms of the models we are going to consider in the following, we're interested in describing the interaction of very large numbers of cells, and in particular, we hope that we are able to create patterns like these. If we look into our fingerprints, then indeed there are some type of patterns which usually occur. So basically, any fingerprint consists of so-called deltas, which you can see over here in the form of a triangle, and so-called cores, which are kind of in the form of a U, as you can see over here. And basically, all fingerprint patterns consist of a certain number of those cores and deltas. So we are in particular interested in being able to simulate these type of patterns. And as I said before, in order to achieve this, we are going to consider the interaction of very large numbers of cells. But we are not only considering the interaction of cells, but those interactions are also influenced by some underlying stress fields. Mathematically speaking, those stress fields can be described by some underlying tensor fields. So we not only consider the interaction between each of those cells, but in addition, we have to consider those underlying tensor fields. And in the end, we hope that we are able to create stationary patterns of this form using mathematical models. Pattern formation has already been discussed quite a lot in literature, and in general, we're considering a very large number of interacting particles with certain interaction forces. In particular, we're interested in looking at short-range repulsive forces so that collisions between the particles are avoided. But on the other hand, we need long-range attractive forces so that we're actually able to see some kind of pattern formation. In the easiest models, we consider radially symmetric forces which are aligned along the distance vector. What is very nice about these assumptions, the third and the fourth assumption, is that the forces can be written as some distance function times some distance vector, and in particular, this means that there exists some potential W, and one can rewrite the resulting equation in a rather nice way. So in order to set up the modeling, one can consider a microscopic model of this form, where n is a very large number of particles. So we have a very large system of ordinary differential equations. then one can consider the limit as the number of particles goes to infinity, because generally speaking, we're considering a very large number of cells. And this is the resulting continuum model one might consider. And if we make those special assumptions on the forces, that they are given as the negative gradient of some potential W, then indeed we can also study the minimizers of this interaction energy rather than looking at the associated continuum model. And indeed, these type of models have already been studied intensively in literature, and they can also be used to describe a very large number of swarming behaviors in nature, such as swarms of birds or swarms of fish and so on. But now we're interested in looking at very complex patterns such as our fingerprints. And in order to do that, we can describe the fingerprint development in 3 phases. In the first phase, a compressive stress field is formed. This has already been described very well more than 10 years ago, so we don't really focus on this first phase. Then in the second phase, we consider the rearrangement of so-called Merkle cells. Given these underlying stresses, the Merkle cells rearrange, and we hope that in the end we get those line patterns, whereas the third phase describes how primary ridges are induced, and in fact this has already been described very well, and it's rather easy, mathematically speaking. So this is the reason why we mainly focus on understanding how those very complex patterns actually arise. And for this, we're going to consider the isotropic pattern formation approach I've described earlier, but we're going to extend it. So we are going to consider interacting cells as before, where the interaction forces are short-range repulsive, long-range attractive. But what is very crucial about the type of models we are considering is that we are considering this underlying stress field in addition. And this is actually responsible for those very complex patterns we hope to see. And in particular, it introduces an anisotropy, which makes the mathematical analysis significantly harder, because we can no longer minimize energy functions. And it's that for this reason, new mathematical methods are basically required to analyze those systems. So generally speaking, in terms of the mathematical formulation, we consider a similar system as before, but now the forces not only depend on the distances between the particles, but in addition on this underlying stress field, which results in patterns of this form. So first of all, you might wonder why this tensor field might actually influence our pattern formation so much. And this can be explained as follows. So in the isotropic setting, you can kind of regard forces as the sum of attractive forces and repulsive forces, where the attractive force is of the form coefficient function times TD. And if you're in the isotropic setting, this can basically be regarded as the tensor field being equal to the identity matrix. So we have a force equal to a negative gradient of some potential. Whereas in the anisotropic setting, we can rewrite the stress field in terms of the direction of smallest and largest stresses. And in particular, we see that the attractive force can be written as the attractive force in the isotropic setting plus some additional repulsive force term. And this is actually crucial, because this means that we have an additional repulsive force along the vector S. So if S would be the vector 0, 1, we expect some repulsive force along the vertical axis. And in particular, this means that we expect some stretching along the vertical axis. And secondly, what we can also see that due to this form of the forces, there's no longer an interaction potential, so we can't do energy minimization or anything like this. in terms of the mathematical analysis, as a first step to analyze those stationary patterns, we need to perform a rigorous limit as the number of particles goes to infinity. So this results in a PDE of this form, which is very crucial for the further analysis. And indeed, this is a rather complicated PDE. So in terms of the analysis, it's often very helpful to make some additional assumptions. And for that, we may assume that T is spatially homogeneous. And indeed, this statement over here shows that if we understand the pattern formation of one specific spatially homogeneous tensor field, then we actually understand it for any spatially homogeneous tensor field. And this means in the following, we are going to assume that for spatially homogeneous tensor fields, the direction of the smallest stresses is always in the vertical direction. So we hope to get some stretching along the vertical axis. And then we can both perform some analysis and some numerical simulations. And here you can see what we expect for different levels of anisotropy. So if we are in the isotropic setting, we expect some ring patterns, whereas as the anisotropy changes and we have a larger level of anisotropy, we hope to obtain ellipse states. And if we have even stronger repulsive forces along that vertical direction, we even get line patterns. And this can also be shown rigorously that the different types of patterns we obtain crucially depend on how strong the levels of anisotropy are. And in particular, if they are very strong, we can also show that those line patterns we obtain are actually stable. So now we have understood that we are able to kind of produce one single ring, one single ellipse, or one single line. But for fingerprint simulations, we're interested in a very large number of lines, and not just one. And so we can also run numerical simulations. The first row is for concentrated initial data, whereas the second row is for randomly uniformly distributed initial data. And here you can see that for randomly uniformly distributed data, we get a larger number of lines, or also a larger number of dots over here. And if you zoom in, you see that these are actually a very large number of ellipses. So this already looks very promising. So we have understood the spatially homogeneous case now. And this makes you wonder whether we can just consider more complex underlying stress fields now and hope that we get stationary patterns which look like fingerprints. So we did some numerical simulations, but as you can see over here, the pattern collapses completely. So that's definitely not what we are interested in, because we want to have stationary patterns which look like fingerprints. And this motivated us to introduce a new bio-inspired model where we considered appropriate force coefficients which are motivated by harmonic oscillators, which is something very common in mathematical biology. So as a force coefficient, first of all, we need to consider this interplay between short-range repulsive, long-range attractive forces, which can be very well described by force and by cosine and sine functions. And secondly, we want to model decaying force coefficients, which can be described by exponentially decaying functions. And using appropriate parameters in there, indeed, we were able to produce stationary patterns. And in particular, if we considered two different realizations of randomly uniformly distributed initial data, we get very similar but not identical stationary patterns. And this is actually something what we also see in biology or in nature in general, because twins have very similar genes but not identical ones. And their fingerprints are also very similar but not identical. Then another question which arises in terms of fingerprint simulations is to be able to vary the width between the lines. And indeed, This is also possible with our models. So by rescaling the force coefficients appropriately, we are also able to rescale the distances between the lines, and this basically allows us to produce any type of patterns as stationary solutions to our models, because those simulations results we obtain depend on the tensor field, but if you use different types of inputs, we are also able to create different types of general patterns. And by rescaling the forces appropriately, we are also able to obtain different distances between the lines, and that's how we can kind of produce any type of patterns using this approach. So just to sum up, in my talk I tried to show you that in biology we can consider quite challenging mathematical models with quite different applications, and in particular in my talk, anisotropy has been very crucial, not only for describing real-world phenomena more accurately, but also for being able to produce any type of very complex patterns. In terms of the analysis, we needed to come up with new methods since we were no longer able to use energy minimization. I talked a bit about the role of anisotropy by considering both those string, ellipse, and line patterns. And we also performed a stability analysis and numerical simulations with the aim of getting a better understanding of pattern formation in nature. Thank you very much for your attention.
Presumably you have examples in 3 dimensions in biology as well, in tissue formation and so on. So were you assuming 2 dimensions for the work here? Or?
Yeah, in this work we mainly assumed 2 dimensions, but what is a really interesting question, what we're currently working on, is understanding how those patterns actually behave in 3 dimensions. For instance, if you look at our fingers, they are nearly in a plane, but what actually happens to pattern formation if you consider more complex surfaces, for instance?
Is that a straightforward generalization, or are there problems that arise in the 3 dimensions?
Well, in terms of numerical simulations, you can definitely extend it, but in terms of the analysis, it definitely gets much more complicated, and the results strongly depend on which type of underlying surface you actually consider.
Would the long-term goal be to, once you actually making images of fingerprints, to then retrofit the parameters in the model, as then storing it in the data? Why wouldn't you go from real fingerprints backwards?
Well, another project I'm currently working on kind of goes into the direction. So, like, if you want to kind of create any type of fingerprint images, one crucial thing is actually to understand how to choose this underlying tensor fields. And in fact, you can regard this as an inverse problem, kind of given a fingerprint image, how do we have to choose those tensor fields that we are indeed able to produce anything we want? Yeah, they definitely occur. I deleted quite a number of slides, so if you are interested in, there are quite a number of those images in the second paper in that list.
Well, I think if we have more questions, we've timed it perfectly. In fact, thank all of our speakers